Every organization has a unique culture. Today's video is about organizational culture, how we define it, and what are some important elements of organizational culture. The first thing I'd like you to do is think about some of the places you've worked or gone to school. What was unique about them? Probably some of it was the culture, or at least contributed to the culture. So for example, I worked at a couple different restaurants in my teenage years and in college, and they were pretty different. They were both breakfast diners, but one had a very clear orientation towards family values. It was family run. The whole family worked there. It was very kind of welcoming and warm. And then another one was less so. The people who worked there didn't care very much about the business. It created a very different working culture. The way we spoke was different at the two different organizations. The things we wore were different. These are examples of organizational culture. One of the definitions we can use for organizational culture is the way we do things around here. It's like the stuff that organizations are made of. It's what kind of breathes life into organizations, is the culture. So you can't necessarily put it down on paper, but it is what makes the organization interesting. This is related to communication because communication creates culture, and then culture then shapes the way people communicate within an organization. So culture and communication are inextricably linked. A more formal definition of organizational culture is a system of shared meanings and beliefs expressed through symbolic forms such as rituals, stories, and myths. So we'll talk a little bit about rituals and stories today. If you think about the places you've worked or gone to school, you can probably identify some important stories. So stories told in organizations about organizations are not simply stories. They often have embedded values and messages. So if you think about the stories that you heard as a new member to the place that you currently go to school or the place you currently work, you can start to identify pieces of the culture. Sometimes it's hard to tell until you've been there a while, but if you reflect back on those stories, those pieces were probably there. So are the stories that are told about hard work and effort and getting ahead, or are they about collaboration and community and how we really care for each other? Or maybe it's a combination of both, but those stories are going to look really different in different organizational cultures, and we can learn about the culture by examining those stories. Rituals are similar. So rituals would be things like how we do our annual holiday party, how we do our monthly staff meeting, kind of how does that work and how does it unfold? Those are rituals. There are often also heroes of different organizations. So I work at Michigan State University, and one of our heroes is Tom Izzo. He is highly regarded by most people in this community. People talk about sightings of him at the grocery store. People talk about his leadership style, and I know it gets taught about in leadership courses. And so he's one of our organizational heroes and would be an important fixture in our organizational stories. Also here at Michigan State, there's a saying which is part of our culture. So when somebody says, "Go green," the response is "Go white." And when I first moved here, a neighbor came out to meet us and they said, "Go green." And I said, "Go green," back. And they looked at me like I had two heads, because that's not the proper response. So these are things that you have to learn, and it's part of the culture. It gets embedded. It identifies who's in and who's out. I was clearly out because I didn't respond correctly to "Go green." There are informal networks within organizations that create the culture as well. So sometimes this is called like water cooler talk or the grapevine. And this is how information moves within an organization that isn't necessarily the formal network. So a formal network might be a supervisor and then subordinates, right? Or employees of that supervisor. And those aren't necessarily the best ways to get information around. Sometimes it's the peer groups, people that have lunch together, people that meet up after work. Those are informal networks, and most of the information that goes around in organizations move through those informal networks. I hope this has helped you understand organizational culture a little bit better and reflect on the organizational cultures that you've been a part of.